We left off the other day talking about the Gulf of Tonkin resolution and how now President Johnson can do anything that he needs to do to quell or suppress North Vietnamese aggression against the South. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution becomes, for President Johnson, the legal basis to escalate war in Vietnam. The Vietnam War is not, in fact, some don't even call it the Vietnam War, they call it the Vietnam conflict. It's not an actual declared war. Remember, Congress declares war. There is no declaration of war here. This makes it a very different war from the Second World War or the First World War. If you remember, in the Second World War, Japan attacked us. We declared war on Japan. And then a couple days later, the Germans declared war on us. This is not like that. Nor is it like the Korean War. The Korean War wasn't a declared war by the United States either. What kind of war, what kind of conflict was the Korean War? It's kind of a proxy war, but yes, what justified this action? Yes. It was a United Nations Security Council call for military action. The Vietnam War is justified based on this Gulf of Tonkin resolution. This is President Johnson getting congressional support to escalate in Vietnam. Did I see a hand over here? Yeah. Yeah, why not declare war? That is a good question. And the problem is, I think you might have a challenge in declaring war in the sense that Congress would have to approve that actual declaration. And North Vietnam had done very little to us at that point. I don't know if they would have gotten that. And then that would have put every congressman, it would have made it Congress's war, not just the president's war. I don't know if they were willing to go that step. But that's my guess. I haven't looked into that question myself. We haven't actually, of all the things we fought in the last 60, 70 years, we haven't actually declared war since 1941. So all of the current conflicts we were involved in, there are no declarations of war anymore. It's not really something we do. Yeah, that's a good question. I think the end result is much the same. Yeah?
Isn't there like some limit to a number of days that the president can have troops in an area without declaring war?
No, but there's going to be some amendments to the president's war powers that result from the Vietnam story. So, and Congress always controls funding. So, we'll talk more about that as we press through this unit. All right. Our first major action in Vietnam is going to be called Operation Rolling Thunder. Operation Rolling Thunder is a sustained strategic bombing campaign. We are going to bomb North Vietnam. And this will be the most massive bombing campaign in military history to this point. Bigger than anything that occurred during the Second World War in terms of tonnage of explosives being dropped. President Johnson's advisors, including a guy who's going to be very important to our story, a guy named Robert McNamara. Please know Robert McNamara. He is Johnson's Secretary of Defense. Before that, he was Kennedy's Secretary of Defense. They concluded that the South's situation, the government in the South, their situation was falling apart. And that a protracted American bombing campaign might allow the South the ability to stand up on its own. Maybe lift their morale. Give them time as the United States begins to take control of this fight. Give them time to establish themselves in South Vietnam. We also hoped that this Operation Rolling Thunder would limit the amount of weapons making it into South Vietnam. On this map here, this is a map of the network of trails known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The Ho Chi Minh Trail went from North Vietnam into South Vietnam, and that's how, but skirting through Laos and Cambodia to get into South Vietnam, that's how the Viet Cong in the South were getting their arms. So our hope was if we started bombing in Operation Rolling Thunder, if we started bombing North Vietnam, that the amount of equipment and amount of what we call infiltrations, people from the north making their way into the south, that they would be limited, that they would actually slow down, and eventually we could start winning this war in South Vietnam. But we have to be careful. We have to be careful. This bombing campaign in Operation Rolling Thunder is massive, but it is a restricted bombing campaign. We don't bomb everything. For example, the capital city of Hanoi in North Vietnam. We don't bomb Hanoi in Operation Rolling Thunder. Anybody want to take some guesses as to why we would leave Hanoi off the table in the beginning of this war? Yes?
Maybe because there's like a lot of people there.
A lot of people there, so
Lots of casualties.
there would be a lot of casualties, guys. And we've already looked at this is a war where people are taking pictures of what's going on and they're making it around the world. And if you start bombing the big cities, you're going to get a lot of deaths, and you're going to get a lot of deaths of young people, right? Kids being killed. Guys, what image was it? What was it that made people around the world start to really look at the Syrian refugee crisis?
The baby on the beach.
Yeah, the little boy that washed up drowned on the beach, right? And then everybody started turning their attention to what the Syrian crisis was, even though that had already been going on for a couple of years.
Now there's
Right.
pictures of like the people starving in these cities.
There you go. So these pictures mean something. So we didn't want to start bombing Hanoi, which is the most populous city in North Vietnam, because it's going to bring a lot of negative images that might not help America's cause. And we need to remember for a moment that, again, not like Korea, and certainly not like the Second World War, the United States wasn't truly attacked by North Vietnam, and this is not a United Nations supported action in North Vietnam. The Soviets and the Chinese are supporting North Vietnam. If we start bombing their capital city, where there are Soviets and Chinese within, if we start bombing Hanoi, that could possibly get them more involved in this conflict. And we have to be very concerned about that. Plus, we want to leave Hanoi untouched, because you can keep that as a bargaining chip. Like, hey, you better come to the negotiating table, because we haven't bombed your capital yet. But that could come down the road. North Vietnam should know that in their minds. Once if you start bombing everything, if you lay all your cards out on the table right at the start of this war, there's no negotiation that can be done, right? You've done everything you could possibly do. So we don't bomb Hanoi, and we limit our bombing, we restrict our bombing to roads and to military sites and to oil depots and oil refineries. And we hope that that will do the job in getting North Vietnam to go to a negotiating table. It's also far less risky to have a bombing campaign like Operation Rolling Thunder. It's far less risky to do that than putting troops in, or doing, the phrase is, putting boots on the ground. If we put soldiers into Vietnam and have them invade into North Vietnam, what's going to start happening to American soldiers? They're going to start dying. And then that's going to change the story for Americans back home. They're going to start dying in large numbers. Guys, it's the same issue today. How are we targeting ISIS today? Through airstrikes, right? Through airstrikes. We're using our Air Force to do it. We're using air power to do it. Barack Obama is very reluctant to put boots on the ground, and he said he's not going to do it short of a handful of special forces guys that are in there assisting. But we're not sending a major force, at least at this point. But this is certainly going to be a talking point in the presidential election, so we'll be interested how that turns out. Initially, this is portrayed as no different from anything that had happened earlier in Vietnam. But this is a major shift in American policy in Vietnam. The United States is getting far more heavily involved. Like, we can argue that we're just supporting the government of South Vietnam still, but we are really leading the fight now in Vietnam. These early raids in Operation Rolling Thunder proved to be ineffective. The bombing of North Vietnam is going to lead to the beginnings of an anti-war protest movement. And we're going to start seeing protests pop up, especially in university campuses around the country. The first notable one being in Ann Arbor at the University of Michigan. What's that? Oh, really? Excellent. Now, don't get me wrong. In 1965, when this is all beginning, these guys, these young people, are absolutely in the minority. Most Americans are supportive of our government's policy in Vietnam at this point, right? Because what have they been hearing? What have Americans been hearing for the last, it's 1965 now, what have Americans been hearing for the last 15 or 20 years? Communism's bad. Got to contain communism. We went through a Red Scare. The domino theory. One country falls and the next and the next and the next. So most Americans are supportive. But as we start bombing North Vietnam, we are killing innocent civilians. Absolutely. And we start to see public opinion for this war effort start to decline. The United States will also start to experience some international criticism. The UN General Secretary, a guy named U Thant, you don't need to worry about his name too much, but just hear it. His name is U Thant. It's T-H-A-N-T, Mr. Shaughnessy, for Quiz Bowl purposes. U Thant is going to publicly disapprove of the United States bombing campaign in North Vietnam. President Johnson, in the midst of this Operation Rolling Thunder, will offer to North Vietnam the opportunity for negotiations. But the North won't accept unconditional negotiations. Neither side at this point is willing to compromise. And as time goes on, we've learned that these bombings are not at all meeting their goals. Strategic bombing, like bombing of highways and roads and infrastructure and water systems, and electric power plants and military facilities. We are really good at that when we're fighting an industrialized nation. We were really good at that doing it to Germany. We were really good at that doing it to Japan. But North Vietnam is a completely different animal, right? North Vietnam is not an industrialized state. When we bombed Germany during World War II, we could bomb the Autobahn. We could destroy their highway system, right? And when you're bombing roads, what's that? Well, we dropped a lot. We could hit roads, yes. We could bomb bridges, right? We could bomb roads and highways, and they're concrete, and then now you've got this destroyed road, and you got to get all that concrete out of there, and you got to pour new concrete over it. It's a disaster for an industrialized state. In North Vietnam, when a bomb hits a road, villagers come around and fill in the hole. And now your road is back to what it was. There aren't a lot of highway systems in North Vietnam. They don't have industry in North Vietnam. Where is North Vietnam getting the weapons that they're supplying to the Viet Cong on the Ho Chi Minh Trail? Soviet Union primarily. Some from China, but mostly the Soviet Union. So can we bomb those facilities? No. We can't start attacking the Soviet Union now. So this is a problem. Yes, sir. Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. So North Vietnam, they don't have heavy industry of their own. They're getting aid from China and the Soviets. Their transportation system is already basic, and like I said, if it gets bombed, the holes can be filled in. The North Vietnamese army has minimal needs. This is not a modern, advanced military in the sense of the United States. And these guys that are making up the North Vietnamese army, some of them are veterans of the fight against the French. Or some maybe even go as far back as the fight against the Japanese. They've been doing this a long time. They're used to military and war conditions, unlike a lot of the guys that are being drafted into the American military. The infiltrations of the South. Remember, that was one of the goals, to limit the number of people making their way into South Vietnam and the number of weapons and arms making their way into South Vietnam via the Ho Chi Minh Trail. As Operation Rolling Thunder moves on, those infiltrations will actually increase. All right? We're not slowing them down at all. More supplies are making their way into the South. And then the North proves itself to have far better anti-aircraft or anti-air weaponry than we ever accounted them to have. Their air defenses are strong. Someone take a stab. Why are their air defenses so strong? Soviet Union. Do you have any piece of evidence that you might use on an essay that proves that the Soviet Union had pretty adept anti-air technology? Yeah, they shot down the U-2, right, in 1960. So the Soviets are supplying the North Vietnamese with anti-aircraft fire. And over the course of the Vietnam War, over 700 American planes will be shot down over North Vietnam. And many of those pilots will be landing in enemy territory, and many of them will be taken as prisoner of war. You guys might know the story of John McCain. He ran for president, right? A senator from Arizona. John McCain was a Navy pilot in Vietnam, and he was taken prisoner, and he served, I believe it was 4 years, 3 or 4 years, as a prisoner of war in what is known to American POWs as the Hanoi Hilton, the prison in Hanoi where these POWs were kept. And John McCain was beaten, and he was tortured, and he was deprived, and he was given an opportunity to leave earlier. But he refused to leave before all of his brothers in arms there that were prisoners with him were able to leave as well. And so that's where John McCain gets his Vietnam War hero credibility from. Anyway. We also begin... Yes, ma'am? Yes. Yes. Yep, the Viet Cong are the communist fighters in the south of Vietnam. We're going to be getting there right now. Yes, so our initial attack is against North Vietnam because they're the ones that fired upon us. But as Operation Rolling Thunder presses on, we begin to start bombing targets in South Vietnam as well. Bombing communist-held targets in South Vietnam. And now you have this weird situation where the United States is in Southeast Asia to support the government of South Vietnam. And in order to do that, we start bombing targets in South Vietnam, bringing further pain and suffering to citizens of South Vietnam who are caught in the middle of this conflict. We also are going to start losing even more popular support for this war as the United States opens up bombing campaigns in the South. Now that we've launched the biggest air campaign in American history to this point, the United States will also send ground forces into South Vietnam for the first time. Now, we'd had advisors before. And guys, if you were to look at the military advisors and then look at these Marines coming off of this plane, they look identical. All right? The advisors were soldiers training South Vietnamese army. Now we are sending in our Marines. These are our first combat troops. These are putting boots on the ground, all right? These are the first actual soldiers going to South Vietnam to fight a war against communists in South Vietnam. They initially get sent because the United States needed to defend our bases. We've got massive air bases that we're using in South Vietnam, and we need to make sure they're defended against attacks. So we send in the first Marines in March of 1945. 65, 45, what? 65. Our earliest strategy for these Marines is called the Enclave Strategy, where they would only be permitted, according to the rules we are setting for them, they would only be permitted to travel within a 50-mile radius of their bases, largely to defend those air bases. This would quickly be abandoned as the Viet Cong prove themselves able to avoid our Marines as they are moving out beyond 50 yards, or only 50 miles from their bases. So by June of 1965, we abandon this strategy and we start pushing deeper into South Vietnam. In July of that same year, Robert McNamara recommends to the President, he's the Secretary of Defense, he recommends to the President that we escalate our troop numbers in Vietnam and we escalate ground combat in Vietnam. Because neither Robert McNamara, nor President Johnson, nor our top generals in the field see this war as a war we could lose. They look at the United States with the most powerful military on the planet, and they look at the Viet Cong guerrilla fighters that we're fighting against, or the North Vietnamese army that we will soon be fighting against, and they don't see this as an even match. And our belief is that if we just send enough guys, if we send enough guys into South Vietnam, we will reach a breaking point with the North, and that they will be forced to negotiate with us on terms that we find favorable. In 1965, we have 100,000 men in South Vietnam. By 1968, that's going to escalate to over 500,000 guys. But this is a very different kind of war compared to the other wars you guys have learned about over the last couple of years. Remember when we talked about the Korean War, for example? And I showed you a few pictures. And we saw the front lines. The North Koreans invaded, and they pushed the South Koreans all the way to the south of that peninsula. And then the United States entered, and we pushed the lines all the way to the north, almost to China, right? And then the Chinese invaded, and they pushed us back south of the 38th parallel. And you could see a clearly defined front line. We saw the same thing in the Second World War, right? When the United States lands and the British and the Canadians land in Normandy and the Soviets are pushing from the east, we see Germany being squeezed, and we see very clear front lines moving from the west and the east, squeezing Germany in the middle. We saw this in World War I, right? A more static western front, but you certainly had a front where on one side of the line you've got Germans and on the other side of the line you have British and French and later Americans. And there was an eastern front as well. And there was a line, and on one side of that line were the Russians, and on the other side of the line were the Germans and the Austrians. And that line would push far into to Russia. Yes, sir?
No, I thought you were talking about World War II.
Oh, I went back to World War I, too. So these front lines in every war that we've ever fought have been clearly defined. In Vietnam, they won't be. Because the Viet Cong is scattered throughout South Vietnam. They're everywhere. And even when we have 500,000 troops in South Vietnam, which sounds like an astronomical number, it's really not that much if we're going to conquer and occupy and provide security to all of these villages and cities in South Vietnam. And so the United States would have a different strategy. Rather than creating defined front lines and trying to sweep through the entire country, trying to push the enemy back. Because here's the problem. How do we possibly sweep this up? In World War II, you could very clearly see who the Nazis were, right? They looked like Nazis. They wore Nazi uniforms. You could very clearly see who the Japanese soldiers were. They looked like soldiers. They wore uniforms, right? In this war, what's the Viet Cong look like? They look like peasant villagers, right? You have no idea who Viet Cong is and who they aren't. It's very difficult. So the United States would enter into a strategy of attrition in Vietnam. We've used this word before, particularly in World War I. A war of attrition, where you attempt to grind your enemy down to the point where they can no longer fight. Vietnam for us becomes a war of attrition. We are going to measure our success based on how many Viet Cong and North Vietnamese we kill. We literally are asking our soldiers to kill and count the bodies and send those body counts, as twisted as this sounds, send the body counts, how many people we have killed, back to your officers and back to Washington, D.C., with the belief that if we can kill enough, while not losing as many ourselves, if we can kill enough, we'll eventually win this war. This is tough, though. It's highly unreliable. Now, here's a picture of soldiers in the field in Vietnam. It's highly unreliable. One of the best memoirs you can read if you ever wanted to pick a book and read what it was like for at least one guy in Vietnam. Philip Caputo wrote a book called A Rumor of War. And in this memoir, it starts off with him just being a young person like yourselves, and he joins the Marines, and he goes to boot camp, and he eventually goes off to Vietnam. And within his book, he's talking about these body counts. You enter into a skirmish. There's a firefight. After the firefight, you go and you literally count how many dead you can find. And for Phil Caputo and others like him, the mantra was, if it's dead and it's Vietnamese, then it's Viet Cong. So you would count it, because you would otherwise have no idea. And so we probably were sending back elevated numbers, because we were probably killing some innocent civilians along the way. Some people that weren't really Viet Cong, but we counted them. And some of it was innocent, like we just didn't know who was Viet Cong or who wasn't. Some of it, you might have had overzealous lieutenants wanting to inflate their numbers, because it might get them another bar on their shoulder, right, a promotion. Regardless, this wasn't working, because the United States underestimated the Vietnamese capacity for losing men. Ho Chi Minh himself said we can lose, I think he said 20 for every one of yours, and we will still win this fight. And we have to remember the nature of Vietnam, which I don't think we really understood all that well at the time. These people, under Ho Chi Minh and in North Vietnam, have been fighting for now 25 years, right? They're fighting us. They were fighting the French before, or the Japanese before. They were fighting the French. And then you go back to thousands of years of Vietnamese history. They have a history of trying to keep outsiders out. They seem to be more willing to sacrifice than we gave them credit for. American soldiers would enter into what were known as search and destroy missions. The goal was to find enemy base camps. And when we found them, we would destroy them. Guys would wander around the jungle. This is something that if you have family members that were in Vietnam, this is likely what they were up to. When my dad was in Vietnam, they went out into the jungle and they walked. And they walked, and they walked, and they walked, and they looked. And they kept their eyes open, and they didn't know what they would find one step after another. On most days, there was nothing. There was no noise, no commotion whatsoever. Absolute boredom. And then you would get these experiences of the most intense 5-10 minutes of your life, where there'd be a quick firefight skirmish. And then that would end. And you might call in an airstrike, where you now have found the enemy. And American jets would come over, and they would drop some napalm bombs. We used a lot of napalm. Napalm is like a jellied petroleum, basically a flammable jelly that would burn everything and stick to things to burn them, and obviously be horribly costly. Yeah, in a lot of the firebombing in Japan. We begin to use so much artillery and so much bombing of South Vietnam that despite the fact that our war was technically against North Vietnam, the United States would drop 2/3 of all the bombs and all the artillery that we used throughout the course of this war in the South. So we are destroying the country of South Vietnam. We are a massive refugee crisis is going to enter into the cities. As the war is going into the rural areas of the countryside, hundreds of thousands of people will flock to the safety of the cities. The United States begins to use a chemical agent called Agent Orange, which is a defoliant. It's a spray, it's a chemical spray that you would spray on the jungle, and it would burn the leaves off of the trees. So you could see where the enemy might be hiding. Unfortunately for our soldiers that fought in this war and for the people of Vietnam and the land of Vietnam, we learned later that Agent Orange is a horrible carcinogen. And a lot of guys that served in this war are going to suffer some ill effects in the years after the war was over. Gives you cancer. Yeah, it's not good for you. We kept looking for this crossover point. At what point would we have enough guys there, and would we kill enough North Vietnamese and Viet Cong that we would now be winning? And we seem to never be getting there. We seem to never actually be getting there. From 1965 to 1967, Americans, according to our body counts and our estimates, we killed 179,000 communists. America lost about 13,000 guys in those 3 years. The Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN, they lost about 50,000 guys. So we're certainly killing more communists than they're killing of our side. But this is still not enough to stem the tide of battle. Every year, there were more communists in South Vietnam and in North Vietnam, going from 17-year-old boys to 18-year-old men. And now they're of age to go fighting in the war. We simply couldn't kill enough fast enough to stem that tide.
It was 50,000.
50,000 ARVN troops. This quest for body counts never gained any territory. We didn't have enough troops in South Vietnam to actually occupy territory. So we would go into a village and we would look for Viet Cong, and if we found any, we would get rid of them and we would maybe destroy the village. And then we'd move on to the next place. And then when we thought we got the Viet Cong out of there, we'd move on to the next place, only to leave the places we've left ready to be re-infiltrated again by Viet Cong. We weren't actually holding on to any territory. We were dropping so many bombs in the South. That some people in the South became sympathetic towards the Viet Cong, or towards the North, because they saw America as bringing more harm. We were also giving the Viet Cong in the South untold numbers of unexploded ordnance. You know, for all the bombs we drop, some of them are duds. Some of them never explode. And the Viet Cong can find these and then take them apart and use the explosives in them for their own purposes. We're going to kill civilians in South Vietnam, and we're going to disrupt the agriculture of South Vietnam. More bombs will be dropped in the Vietnam War than during the entire course of the Second World War by all sides. And look how small that country is compared to the Asian and the European theaters. And now we've got thousands upon thousands of refugees flooding into southern cities, causing more instability there and for the South Vietnamese government. Questions, comments, concerns?